The man who followed Harry Truman in the White House was Dwight Eisenhower, of course the great former World War II general. Eisenhower was enormously popular and very likable after the somewhat cold and calculating Harry Truman. We'll talk more about Eisenhower and his domestic policies in the next lecture about the 1950s. For the moment, we're going to be concentrating on his thinking about diplomacy and international affairs. As you might imagine, being a former general and very much familiar with the needs of the military, Eisenhower placed a great emphasis on intelligence and technology. This is the age of spies and kind of the heyday of spies. And Eisenhower believed that obtaining good intelligence, good information, could save a great deal. Eisenhower's Secretary of State was named John Foster Dulles. The two of them worked very closely together. I've seen it written by at least one historian that they were the closest Secretary of State and President in our nation's history. I'm not sure that there's a definitive way to prove that, but certainly the two understood each other and largely agreed with each other, and did work very closely in developing America's policies during this time. So Eisenhower is the first Republican in the White House since Herbert Hoover. And he did share some of the Republican beliefs in smaller government, limiting government expense, although, as we'll see in the next chapter, he works with a scalpel rather than just tearing down everything that FDR and Truman put together. But in terms of his foreign affairs, he does try to save as much money as he can in our expenses on defense without leaving us threatened. And so things like the emphasis on intelligence and technology are part of that. How can we protect ourselves to the same extent without spending as much money? Well, spies, good information, more powerful weapons, more effective weapons are cheaper than maintaining a huge standing army. Dulles and Eisenhower's program was known as the New Look. The New Look. And while there was much that was familiar about the New Look, there is perhaps a greater emphasis on nuclear weapons and air power than there had been in the past, which leads us to one of the other kind of catchphrases of the Eisenhower days: mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The thought is that nuclear weapons are always an option, even if it's a relatively small situation. And so the threat of nuclear weapons becomes a very effective deterrent. At the same time, there is a sort of brinksmanship at work. This leads us into the years of the Cold War that are quite frightening at times. The thought that at any moment, one side or the other might press the button to launch their nukes, and as we mentioned previously, the entire world would be destroyed. The other phrase or idea that really gains currency in the Eisenhower years was the domino theory. I think I've mentioned this briefly already, but the idea that if one nation falls to communism, then the next will fall, and the next, like a string of dominoes. And so we must always be at the ready to stop that first domino from falling or the next domino from falling. As I mentioned earlier, if China was the first domino, which was a popular thought at that time, then what is the next potential domino? Maybe it's Korea, maybe it's Vietnam, but we've got to always be there to stop whatever that next domino is. In general terms, the diplomacy of the 1950s witnessed something of a thaw in the Cold War compared to what we had seen in the Truman years. Part of that was due to changes in leadership in both of the superpower nations. In the United States, Truman is replaced by Eisenhower. And as we've seen, Eisenhower in some ways seems to be a more likable, more approachable, perhaps even more thoughtful figure than Truman was. And on the Soviet side, Joseph Stalin dies. There is a year or two of kind of changes at the top before leadership falls to Nikita Khrushchev. Now, Khrushchev is not exactly warm and fuzzy, and he certainly has his moments of prickliness, but he was definitely not as paranoid, as closed-minded, and perhaps as intense as Stalin had been. And so on both sides, there seems to be a bit of an opportunity for the sides to open their doors a little bit. And to be open to discussion and negotiation. In general, we refer to this as détente, and this is something that we will come back to a couple of different times during the Cold War. But détente means this sort of lowering in the intensity of the Cold War. At times in the 50s, we appear close to peace with the Soviet Union itself. And so what we begin to see more in the 50s is attention to other parts of the world, what in some ways become the front lines of the Cold War in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America. Khrushchev and Eisenhower got along fairly well personally. You see the picture of them there with their wives. They actually met personally several times in what were known as summit meetings, these meetings of the great leaders. And the two of them had something of an understanding that, no one else in the world could understand what it was like to be them, to be the leader of a superpower nation. And so in some ways they eased the pressure on each other while they each focused their attention on those nations at the periphery, and they each had things to deal with. This also leads us into the beginning period of the cultural Cold War. As this thaw begins to set in, both sides agree to allow samples from the other nation's culture, visitors from the other nation, athletes from the other nation, and so on, to begin to creep in to their nations. This is the cultural exchange program of the Cold War, which was formalized in 1957 with a formal agreement that would oversee the many exchanges that went on from that point throughout the Cold War. Later on, we would nickname this ping-pong diplomacy for the famous 1972 visit of the American ping-pong or table tennis team to China. You see a picture of that down at the bottom. Why would we send our ping-pong team to China? Of course, they were going to be destroyed in those games, but it's a way to open the door. It's a seemingly harmless way of kind of getting in, and then other perhaps higher level discussions will follow. And we really see this throughout the Cold War. There were many sporting exchanges. The Soviets several times sent their famous ballet troupe, the Bolshoi Ballet. There were chess matches. Student exchanges, academic exchanges, and all kinds of other things. Well, how does this work in terms of the Cold War? I'll share one example, which was the Moscow Fair in 1956. In 1956, Moscow was hosting this, essentially a world's fair, a major fair where different nations set up various displays of their culture. And the United States was invited to this exhibit. This was the first time we had really been invited kind of behind the Iron Curtain. And so the United States was going to take full advantage of this opportunity. And we sent a magnificent display with the most modern automobiles and clothing and dress and appliances. The most popular display was the women's apparel and makeup. Russians lined up by the thousands to explore the American display at this fair, and we have records of the comments. We have the comment sheets of many of the people who saw the display. They left kind of with their jaws on the floor. This is the kind of stuff that average Americans have. They were just dumbstruck at all of the kinds of things that Americans could consume. And there got to be concern on the Soviet side that their people were wondering, why can't our government provide these things? What's wrong with our country? So much concern that the Soviets actually made the United States take down their display 2 weeks earlier than was scheduled. So this is one example of the cultural Cold War. There are challenges and weaknesses associated with it. On the one hand, the race issue on the home front was always a pressing concern. How could we argue that our nation was superior when, in fact, a large portion of the population lived this kind of second-tier existence? And the race issue was something that the Soviets were quick to throw in our faces. The newspapers and magazines in the Soviet Union frequently ran articles, and we'll talk about this in a future lecture, but this was the age of the civil rights movement and violence in the streets and lynchings and attacks and these sorts of things, and the Soviets were quick to criticize. There was also the thought that this felt a little bit like brainwashing, that we were trying to convince people of something that perhaps they didn't want to be convinced of. And in general, that's not the way the United States operates. And then there is the challenge of, well, who is in charge? Culture is a very difficult thing to control. Now, there were official government programs that oversaw these cultural exchanges. At the same time, what if things like Playboy magazine reached the Soviets through the black market? Is that the kind of message we want to send about our country? And it did. What if the music of Elvis Presley made it through to these other countries on the black market? And there was a lot of controversy about Elvis. And what if the culture that we do send just doesn't measure up to international expectations? There was one example when we sent some of our modern art, the art of Jackson Pollock, who basically just splashed paint on a canvas. And the international display of his art was a flop because people looked at it and said, this is what artists in the United States are doing? This is crazy. So there were challenges, there were weaknesses with the cultural aspect of the Cold War. Nonetheless, it was an area that we tried to harness to our advantage, and the Soviets did as well throughout the Cold War. One of the other challenges of the cultural aspect of the Cold War is that it relied on the atmosphere in the Cold War being warm enough that each side would agree to send these cultural representatives from one side to the other. And while there was a bit of a thaw in the middle of the 1950s, we begin to see something of a refreeze in the atmosphere as we approach the later 1950s, beginning with the launch of the first space satellite called Sputnik in 1957. The Soviets launched this satellite, and you see a picture of it there on the right. Now, Sputnik itself posed little of a threat. It was little more than a metal ball that sent out a few signals. But what really concerned the United States was the rocket technology that had been able to launch Sputnik into outer space. And the concern was, if the Soviets had the rocket technology to put this satellite into space, then they could certainly have the technology to launch perhaps a nuclear warhead or a nuclear weapon. And the United States knew that we didn't have that technology at that time. And this led to something of a panicked, certainly very urgent response. NASA was created in 1958 to launch the American space program. And, of course, the space race was then underway. And you guys are familiar, I'm sure, with the process in the space race. The United States trying to get some rocket up into space, trying to get a satellite into space, then putting a man into space, putting a man into orbit, and finally putting a man on the moon, which the United States, of course, did in 1969. So the launch of Sputnik began to create an atmosphere of tension and fear that was cemented in 1960. On May 1st in 1960, an American spy plane called the U-2 spy plane was shot down deep in Soviet airspace. Eisenhower and the United States sort of bungled the issue at first. Eisenhower claimed it might have been a weather balloon or something like that, and the Soviets rolled out the wreckage of the plane. Eisenhower then claimed, well, the pilot must not have known what he was doing. He flew off course, and then the Soviets brought out the pilot himself, whose name was Gary Powers. Powers had not been able to take his cyanide pill, and thus he had to explain what he was doing. And so it was a very embarrassing episode for Eisenhower. It led to a very frosty atmosphere between Eisenhower and Khrushchev. I described at one time their relationship was quite friendly. The two of them met one last time not long after the U-2 incident, and nothing was accomplished at that last meeting. And in fact, Khrushchev walked out of the meeting in frustration. So as we reach the end of the 1950s and head into the early 1960s, we are heading into what would be the tensest period of the entire Cold War.